This is Louis Zumbaugh with Rush Hour Ag. Leave your message after the tone.
Hey, Louie, it's Elliot Henderson. I can't wait to tell you about
rolling down the back road, truth riding with the dust, talking agriculture policy with people you can trust. From the field to the Capitol, we're breaking it down. Real talk, real issues from a real farm town. Every hour's rush hour when the work won't wait, so we're cutting through the noise and setting things straight.
What's your rush today, Elliot? Welcome, guests, to this episode of Rush Hour Ag. Today we have an exciting guest. Her name is Sarah Lovas. Is that correct?
That is
All
correct.
right.
Yep.
And you're from North Dakota?
That is correct. Yep.
And you had a lot to do with legislation up there that dealt with pesticides. Is that correct?
That I was definitely one of the people who spoke on behalf of that. That it was House Bill 1318. Yes.
Okay. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself or where you come from and what got you interested in doing all this?
Great. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. First of all, it's really fun to be here and get a chance to talk about egg policy a little bit, and especially dealing with environmental issues because I think that side of policy for agriculture sometimes gets overlooked. But I'm originally from the northeast corner of North Dakota. I grew up on a sugar beet and potato farm up there, and went to North Dakota State University, go Bison. Um, and got a degree in egg systems management and a minor in plant sciences, and worked as an agronomist in various capacities for my career. Spent a lot of time in the field scouting crops, independent crop consulting, and crop consulting is still something that's really important in North Dakota, and still very important fabric of piece of our agricultural practice that we do up here for raising crops. I went back to NDSU and got a master's degree in soil science. And so soils is definitely my favorite part of agronomy. But along with that comes a lot of other, um, thoughts about environmental, how agriculture impacts or interacts with our environment, I should say. And so along the way, I kind of got interested in egg policy, and especially egg policy as it relates to just that how agriculture and the environment intersect. So I actually spent a number of years working doing independent crop consulting, and so pesticide recommendations were definitely part of that. And so as time has moved on and we've seen more challenges with EPA getting our pesticides labeled, and now as we've seen in years past, where we see interaction with the court systems and some court proceedings definitely affecting how we have access to certain pesticides. I've become even more interested in participating in those conversations. In this last legislative session in North Dakota, we had a House Bill 1318, which dealt with pesticide labeling, which affirmed that the EPA granted label is in fact the law. So I guess that's kind of the story of how I got to this point. I've been involved with a lot of different organizations, and with regard to this particular bill, I ended up having the opportunity to. I currently serve as a director on the North Dakota Grain Growers Association, and so I represented that organization. I've also spent a number of years working with the North Dakota Crop Consultants Association, and so I did actually help help them and represented them with regard to this particular bill as well.
Sarah. I listened to the debate that occurred on the floor there. There was a good video on your guys' legislative page, and it was a pretty lively debate. And I can remember I tuned into it last night, caught a lot of the cons to it, and then when I woke up this morning, I listened to a lot of the pros of it. And I thought they did a pretty good job of having both perspectives on it. But I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that your state faced as they were working their way through that.
Yeah. So it was an interesting progression how it worked through our system in North Dakota. So House Bill 1318 was introduced in the House chamber, and so actually the first time, and in North Dakota, every single bill gets a hearing and every single bill gets heard on the floor. So There are
Real
no bills. What's that?
seriously, every bill.
Yep, every bill.
Wow.
And we also have, um, and maybe this is something that's unique, but our legislature in North Dakota only meets every biennium, and by constitution, we can only have an 80 days only to meet for our legislature. So they have to get done in a certain amount of time. Usually, the legislature will leave a couple of days left over just in case they have to get called back to like take care of some kind of business within the rest of the biennium. But and so I think this year we finished up with 74 days total.
Wow.
Um, yep, and every single bill gets heard. Every single bill gets also heard on the floor.
What's your makeup of legislators, party wise?
We are vastly a Republican
Okay.
state, very uh, very dominated that way. So, um, and within that, you can actually find some divisions between the Republican Party where you're going to find more moderates, and then you're going to find some pretty far um, right individuals.
So, like on this
And
issue,
within
how did the party split?
actually the right wing was actually at the very end of it very opposed to this bill. As a matter of fact, there's been some conversations within the agriculture community of North Dakota currently about some of the final conversations with House Bill 1318 and how we're very concerned that agriculture isn't necessarily being represented very well by that faction um, of the Republican Party, quite frankly.
And the bill itself, what did it actually do?
The duty to warn, I think, is some pretty important language in that bill, and that's what a lot of the
Yes.
opposition was around.
The intent of this bill is to make sure that the EPA granted label is in fact regarded as the label and that it does a sufficient job for duty to warn. It regards the work as the EPA as a letter of the law so that we can maintain. So, really, our concern here in North Dakota came out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that happened a few years ago, where Roundup was basically the label was vacated because of a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision that happened. Now, later on that year, in I think it was September of 2022, the EPA said that we're not going to vacate the Roundup label because we have done a sufficient job um, warning everyone, and in fact, it is not a carcinogen, and therefore we will keep the label on the market. And so we were able to have access to that. But we have become concerned that if you go to your favorite court of appeals, you can find a decision there that will overturn all of the work of the EPA and bar us from having access to pesticides. So what this bill did in essence is it stated that the EPA labeled has done a sufficient job of warning the public about the risks inherent with use of pesticides, and that label provides sufficient information how to handle that pesticide safely.
Some of the opposition to it, I thought they had some pretty strong arguments, though, where there'd been some past somewhat corruption of the EPA, where officials were able to swing decisions within that organization, but also the way that this bill was presented, a lot of folks saw it as it was going to have some effect on due process and take out the court's ability to allow these frivolous lawsuits just to get sorted out in the courts or be thrown out in the courts. I remember hearing a lot of that in that debate.
So it's interesting that you bring that up because I think it was on the internet just the other day. It made it sound. I saw a headline that stated that um, these pesticide bills going through state legislators were posed by sick farmers who wanted to, sue these companies because they hadn't had an opportunity to sue these chemical manufacturers. Interestingly enough, um, in North Dakota, the entire North Dakota Ag Coalition, which is the entire agriculture community on a whole, if you will, from a policy perspective. So it's all of our commodity groups, um, all of its members. The one member, the one organization that is significant that probably is not a member of that Ag Coalition is the North Dakota Farm Bureau. Um, but that entire Ag Coalition and North Dakota Farm Bureau were very supportive of having this particular House bill get passed because of its protection for farmers to have access to the pesticide technology that it needs. Now, it's interesting that it feels to me when I take a look at some of these headlines that are coming out, and after I take a look at the amount of how the agriculture community participated in supporting the passage of this particular bill, I do honestly feel like some of these headlines, at least dealing with North Dakota's particular pesticide bill, are slightly swayed and slightly not accurate. So the two major groups that opposed this bill were the trial lawyers because they wanted, obviously this could cut into their business of not of lawsuits, and also environmental groups. Interestingly enough, it quickly became a debate about the safety of pesticides. And if you listen to the final House floor debate uh, before it went to the governor, you'll find that there was actually quite a bit of disinformation on there. Disinformation where Agent Orange was actually compared to glyphosate. And for anyone who has any experience working with these pesticides, the safety differences, the toxicity differences between those two active ingredients is apples and oranges. It's not a fair comparison. I know that many of us were very concerned about that disinformation.
One thing I found interesting that I think to me, you alluded to it, but maybe I just read between the lines, but uh, especially with the environmental groups, uh, they were trying to say that the science can follow the money, if is what you were saying by swaying the EPA, which is often what the other side uses when they're arguing things. If you want science, whoever's paying for it usually gets what they want sometimes. So that's kind of interesting how the environmental groups kind of, if I'm reading between the lines right, kind of flip that to try to help them.
It is really interesting. And, um, uh, so this is the first piece of legislation I would say that I've dealt with when it comes to pesticide labeling, but I have interacted quite a bit actually with the EPA um, on different pesticide labeling things. And, it's interesting because I feel like trying to get the EPA to understand what's going on with agriculture is a huge challenge. As a matter of fact, the Grain Growers Association in North Dakota, we have what's called an e-tour, and that's actually coming up here in a couple of weeks at the end of June, where we invite members of the EPA from Washington D.C. and also our region office in Denver to come on out to North Dakota, and we bring them out to different agricultural farming operations, different agricultural things, so we can interact with them and really help them understand what it's like to farm, what it's like to actually handle pesticides, and what it's actually like when we're making decisions on pesticide um, application decisions.
So, who
Um,
are you getting to do that, and what's the participation like in that?
it's been so we've been doing this. Grain growers have been doing this for 31 years, I think, and it's been pretty good. Um, So far, normally we get about 10 to 12 people to come from Washington D.C., and it's EPA members from all different backgrounds. It's it's interesting because the culture of the individuals that come from Washington D.C., I can tell you way different than my own culture. But it's been so fun because I actually get a chance to learn from them how things are working in DC when they're working with different items with pesticide labeling. It helps me kind of understand the other side of the coin a little bit
Sure.
when they're dealing with I only I wanna make sure I have dead weeds. I wanna make sure that my crop is gonna be the best out there that it possibly can be. But they're the type of people that will say, "Okay, but we need to make sure that we're taking care of this other side." And it really helps me understand that.
Well, and many of them people don't have any kind of ag background, or maybe never been to a farm before that. Maybe never been to a
Abs
flyover state before that.
Absolutely. And we are talking about extremely brilliant people. I mean, these are extremely talented scientists, very smart,
But
but they've never had the opportunity to see how things work.
but
You know,
I don't mean, but were they really probably weren't defending agriculture though as much as maybe they were defending their own work, because they felt they did the research, they felt they've done everything they needed to do this correctly, and here these people are challenging their work. Maybe in their minds it wasn't so much about agriculture, but it was about the job that they had done, and not belittling their outcome. Does that make sense?
it it does to me. Again, the scientists that are at EPA are extremely brilliant people. Okay, they might not understand necessarily what a sprayer is. They might not understand what we think of as modern agriculture. A lot of the conversations that we have with EPA end up being around, what a modern farm really is. Last year, we took them out to a John Deere dealer and showed them what a see and spray sprayer is and how it works. And many of them were floored that a farmer would own a sprayer of this size, a self propelled sprayer of this size. Well, you go out to Western North Dakota, and there are fields that are, a section in size easily to 1,000 acres in size easily. You're going to have equipment of a size to get across that efficiently.
Sure.
And, by the way, the land out there is worth less than it is in Iowa. So, and yeah, we're still having that kind of equipment. And then when we could talk about the technology that goes into there and how that impacts um, spraying technology, reducing pesticides, and what that means for the policy behind it, and the fact that farmers and applicators are professionals at what they do and helping EPA and people outside of agriculture to understand that is critically important.
Well, that perspective on the EPA, that you mentioned there, to me, as I wrap my head around this conundrum, it's not really like we're at odds against EPA. They're the ones that have the science. They know the science, and they know that these products, they've built the labels, that they've approved what they've approved. They know the science. The problem is more with maybe the doctors or these other associations that are trying to identify the cause of cancer have been being came come from these products. And so EPA, I would think, EPA and the associations are more aligned in trying to, trust the science and look at the science, not look at, well, we think this is why the cancer is being caused from these products.
You know, it's really interesting that you bring that up because it seemed like earlier in my career, we were always trying to be we were it always felt like we were kind of at odds with EPA, and yet it feels like EPA is the organization that is more grounded in science today than some of these other organizations. When I was first starting to testify to House Bill 1318 in the Agriculture Committee, and I started really engaging on the Senate side. In the House side, the first time it was heard, actually, it sailed through with a 100% green vote and no problems in committee. It wasn't really until it got onto the Senate side that the opposition started coming out of the woodwork. And so then I started really engaging with this particular policy item.
There's
And
no evidence that this molecule is causing the problems. There's no science that's measuring this amount is what's causing this result. And I think EPA would be an ally on defending those facts.
I would hope so. EPA did not put forth any testimony for or against House Bill 1318. But when it was heard on the Senate side in committee, I actually showed a toxicity chart that showed the toxicity, the LD50, both the acute and the chronic LD50 for glyphosate in comparison to other molecules. And then, some of those meetings that I participated in were in the morning. And I said, glyphosate is actually less toxic than caffeine.
So
And of course, all of the legislators, all the senators are sitting there drinking their coffee.
what's an LD50? What is that you're talking about? That measurement. So for the listeners, how are we looking at this stuff?
So it should be the lethal dose 50. And what that means is that 50% of the population would die from that ingested amount. So it's a measure of toxicity, and it is very much so a standard measured measure of toxicity, where we rank different molecules against each other. In other words, the greater the LD50, the less toxic it is. That means you can ingest more of that molecule before you reach that point where 50% of the population, quote unquote, dies.
So who's consuming that much glyphosate?
I
Anybody?
would love to know. I don't know, but you would apparently have issues with caffeine before you would have issues with glyphosate. So,
So that
and it was, and that particular fact got brought up time and time again by the opposition, that nobody believed that. And quite frankly, the chart that I put forward was, I think it was advocated by the World Health Organization, National Health Institute in the United States. I think the EPA was on it. I'd have to go back and look at my testimony, which is written. And but yeah, I mean, we're not talking about junk science organizations here.
so the bill and the law is basically that the EPA labeling is the law. So how does that
Correct.
affect anybody's legal protection? I mean, so are the manufacturers any more or less protected than they were before from being sued?
I don't believe that that is the case. I'm of course not a lawyer, and so you would need to ask a lawyer. Um, but that's not the intention of the bill. Okay, the intention of the bill is when they get sued, it does not automatically vacate the label.
Right.
In other words, so if a court in California has a lawsuit in it against a basic manufacturer, in North Dakota, we will still have access to use that label for that pesticide until the EPA vacates that label and says that it's not okay to use.
So
D- does-
it didn't, I mean, if you watch the commercials or anything, it's basically saying it's taking your rights away uh, for suing or anything like that if you're one of the people that feels that you were poorly affected by the product. But it doesn't do any of that. It's just saying that that label is the legal label and that's the law in North Dakota.
Here's a question. We're in the United States of America. Have we ever been able to stop lawyers from suing people?
Well, not to my knowledge.
I mean, I don't want to make light. I realize we're having a very serious conversation here about legal issues, but let's just be real. In the United States of America, lawsuits and suing other people is quite frankly part of our daily lives.
Right, but
That's
their goal must have been to get rid of the EPA labeling altogether of this product, so that they could say it was uh, cancer causing. Is that what their goal was?
I can't speak to what their goal
I
is.
understand
I
that.
think the
I
goal is to make it that they couldn't use the duty to warn. So using duty to
yeah,
warn is how they're kind of breaking the entry part to figure out, was there, did that company act in a bad manner, that uh, they knew that the product was a bad product and it had an issue. And
Sure.
that's how they're bringing these lawsuits up, is saying that, well, Monsanto acted in bad faith. They knew that there was a problem with their product, but they didn't warn us about it. And then they use that time to investigate what those practices were that they committed to find them liable.
that would make sense to me. Again, I'm not going to speak to what their intentions were. I can certainly speak to what my intentions were to sitting on my side. But it seems like they were trying to use the duty to warn as a way, quite frankly, saying that the duty to warn has not been sufficient, and therefore, we should. I think it's a way to get rid of pesticides.
If this
Sure.
bill wants to take away or at least throw out that duty to warn is not going to be an avenue that you're going to be able to reach a settlement or bring a lawsuit about.
I I don't think it has anything to do with bringing forward a lawsuit. I think it has everything to do that once the lawsuit is brought forward, your label will not be vacated.
What does that mean?
See,
Won't be vacated.
so if you cannot sell or use a pesticide if it does not have a label. So if a label gets vacated, you can no longer use that pesticide legally in the United States of America. So what happened
Lord
back
God
in
here.
2022 is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ended up vacating the Roundup label. So what would have happened that year, and the way that that went down is they were going to let us all use our ending stocks, and then the next year, when all those ending stocks were gone, we wouldn't have had access to that molecule to spray Roundup anymore. But in September of 2022, um, the EPA came back and said, there's no basis for vacating this label. We're going to maintain the label. But if a label is vacated, that means you cannot legally sell or purchase that product, and nor can you apply it. The label is the law. And if you do not apply, buy, sell um, pesticides within the confines of that label, you are violating the law, and it is illegal.
So if we'll just pick on California because they're easy to pick on. If they would go to court and somehow that state could still vacate that label, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
And if they
and
did
you
that,
know,
it would not affect North Dakota.
well, if so,
Right.
that was a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision in California,
Okay.
but it affected the national label for Roundup.
So
So labeling is generally handled federally out of the EPA, right?
Yep.
But within that, each state can still um, restrict pesticides even further. Okay, now that's all on the executive branch of things. So, in North Dakota, it's through our Department of Agriculture. EPA still federally is administering the label, but in North Dakota, like it's our Department of Agriculture that would restrict labels even further. But in this instance, in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, they stated that this label has too much risk for health. The duty to warn isn't there. We need to vacate this label. And so, because of that court decision, that label was vacated.
And then, so is what I'm getting at then is that circuit might have did that, but in North Dakota, you would not recognize that.
We wouldn't recognize that decision based on
well,
this, or at least it would give us a basis to go back
Right.
to
Okay.
the court ourselves and say, you don't have standing in North Dakota to have this decision stand up here.
Right. Okay. This was more than a 1 year fight, I assume.
Actually, this bill was introduced. Um, and actually, this bill was introduced in my by one of my legislators from my own district, who farms. His name is Jared Haggart. Representative Jared Haggart was the prime sponsor on this bill in North Dakota. But yeah, again, our legislature only meets every 2 years. I wasn't aware that this bill was going to be coming forward
Wow.
prior to about December.
that was a big part of their debate that the opposed wanted to just let it lie because other states were taking multiple years to keep debating this, and your state thought that some of the people thought that they should let it lie.
Yeah, and of course that can of course be just as much of a political strategy as anything else, right?
Sure.
Let's just delay
Oh.
the decision.
Yep.
Yeah, just stall it.
Yep.
And in North Dakota, we have a legislature that meets every biennia. So it's not like we're going to get another shot at this bill next year. It's going to be 2 years down the road. So, yeah, we could let it stall and just kind of see what happens. But the flip side of the coin is we could pass it, which we did, and see what happens in the next 2 years. And, if it isn't working out, then I guess they can take another stab at it too and try to undo it. So I mean, there's always two ways to skin a cat, right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
But this the way you guys got it done, it should add some strength to the use of that product and hang the hat on EPA that if something needs to be changed, that is going to have to be the organization that changes it.
Exactly. And that really does make a lot of sense. If you go to court and you've got one judge who is an expert in the law, that does not make that individual an expert in environmental science, pesticide use, farming. If you have a jury of individuals, um, you know, they probably go to the grocery store and purchase food, but they probably don't handle pesticides the same way that all of us do. And I always go back to the fact that farmers live at the point source of any contamination that's going to happen. And, I've got a young son. I I don't want him to be poisoned any more than anybody else wants. And I live here and I've worked with pesticides for my entire career. So I wouldn't do anything to harm, the food that we eat, the water that we drink, and I certainly wouldn't want to do that to anybody else. I take pride in making sure that we've got good food products out there.
Well, I've toured some of these manufacturing facilities for these chemicals, and I mean, those guys handle those chemicals every day, 365 days a year. Well, I jump in a sprayer, and I don't know, is it 15, 25 days a year that I actually handle chemistry? I would
Yep.
think, and sure, we're consuming the food and we're eating, whatever, but those guys handle that product all day for their work day. If there was a place where there was gonna be a problem, it'd be those people, I would think.
I would think so. I've never even thought of it from that standpoint, but that makes a lot of sense.
I think sometimes what happens is these efforts to do away with pesticides and all that, they start in more urban areas more than likely. Uh, I know as being a supervisor, they talk about farm size and there are a lot of small farmers out there that do a really good job, and there's a lot of small farmers out there that want to be farmers that give it up pretty fast when they find out how much work's involved in it, especially when you're growing fruits and vegetables for immediate sale. But they get a little bit confused as to how many people they can actually feed and how many people the actual farmer in the United States is really uh, has to feed if you want to feed the population as a whole. And I think there gets to be a confusion in there of what's better, what's not as good. Uh, just because it comes from a big farm doesn't make it not as good as what comes from a small farm. You might prefer the small farm. A lot of people nowadays, at least in Iowa, they want to know where their beef comes from. They want to know where their sweet corn comes from. Uh, and that's just not, that's great if you can do that. Not everybody has that fortune to be able to do that.
Well, and I think you bring up a really good point. And here's a good question. What size is big? What size is small? Somebody help me quantify this.
Well,
And and I could give you a specific example. So in North Dakota, there is an environmentalist group that opposes a lot of modern agriculture issues. And interestingly enough, this idea of farm size came up, and we're getting a large dairy coming into this area, and my community is very excited about this actually, and it's coming up in my community. Been working with these dairy guys; they're great. We're really excited. But at one of these meetings, this environmentalist group got up and was speaking, and they said, really, we need to have small farms. And I said, okay, what's big? What's big? And in front of this whole room, this particular environmentalist stated 30,000 acres is too big, and farmers should only be able to farm the land that they own. They should not be able to rent land.
and
It was
30,000 is too big.
30,000 is too big.
Usually the answer is
So
just 1 acre more than I've got or 1 cow more than I've got, but yeah, I guess coming from him, he had a number.
Yeah,
I was impressed.
I'm just impressed. I don't know what North Dakota ground sells for, but I'm not impressed by it. I'm bewildered by his coalition that 30,000 is too big, so you can have up to 30,000 acres, but you need to own all of it.
You need to own all of
So
it.
in Iowa, to own all that would be a pretty good mountain of cash. I don't know what it'd be in North Dakota, but chances are you'd have to have a couple of them oil fields on your farm to pull that off.
Well, and we don't have oil all over the state either. It's interesting. I think there was a land sale out here, like right in my backyard, just a couple weeks ago. That was like, $8,400 an acre or something like that, which for us is huge. That's really high. I
Mm,
mean, I that was a pretty good sale, I think. But I've also am aware of some that's happened on some other better ground that is north of 10. Now, this is all Red River Valley ground. You start going west, and it's going to drop off pretty good. And what is a field size? I actually, in my professional career, work in precision agriculture, and I have the opportunity to work with people all over the United States. I could tell you when I am mapping a 1,200-acre field up in Saskatchewan, which I guess that's Canada, but or Montana. I've done that before in Montana. That's way different than trying to work with, for example, I'm working with a guy out in New Jersey right now, and their entire farm is 3,600 acres, and I think they're one of the largest farms out there.
right.
So, it's it, size. What is too big? What is too small? And just the size of the farm does also has nothing to do with the detail that the farmer has for each individual acre. And I know that sounds really crazy when you start thinking about one field being 1,200 acres in size again. I'll just go back to that number because you wouldn't think you'd be able to be that detailed. But boy, I tell you what, when you start thinking about the things that you can do with technology and how you can bring all that together, I know some really detailed farmers who know exactly what's going on every single acre.
You talked about farm size. I got a quick little story. Back in the early 90s, uh, I used to work for a seed company just part time. I was still farming, but worked for them part time, and I was seeding soybeans for them. And they were foundation seed, so it was Asgrow, and Asgrow was still separate yet. They weren't part of Monsanto. Anyhow, I kind of started complaining because foundation seed you don't have a lot, and of course you plant soybeans the year before the corn, so you don't contaminate your seed corn. But anyway, to make a long story short, complained one day that they were putting me on all their fields were all so small because everything was 4 acres here, 5 acres there. So they took me to one of their largest fields to seed down for them. It was like 35 acres, and it was several 5 acre patches that all hooked together in the middle. It wasn't any better than any of the other fields I'd been in. The ironic part was that a couple of years later, I found out we were actually planting Roundup, the beginning of Roundup Ready
Hmm.
soybeans. And I found that out because I ran out of seed in one field too early, and that field sat bare. The part I didn't get seeded because it was had to be kept separate, so it just was left alone. It was my mistake, but anyway. So field sizes does vary across the nation, no doubt. And what you think is big, my brother always says, the guy that farms 500 wants to farm 1,000. The guy that farms 1,000 wants 1,500, and so on and so on and so on. And I don't know what the right size is, but I do know that if I owned 30,000 acres in North Dakota and had to own it all to be a farm, and it was in the Red River Valley at $10,000 an acre, I'd be picking high cotton.
Well, we don't raise a lot of cotton in North Dakota,
Well,
but sure.
that's just the high cotton is just the term down south for doing well.
But yeah, back to the glyphosate thing, looking at some of these settlements or I don't know, court cases, there ain't a single one of these cases that a judge determined this. This was all juries of peers and it wasn't science based. They didn't look at the facts. It was really more emotionally driven and you know, this is going to cost agriculture in the future if we continue to let this happen.
I really think that's an important component. And again, I want to go back and talk about the amount of disinformation that was on the House floor for the last session, hearing this bill. I could tell you there was a number of individuals within North Dakota agriculture that was extremely concerned about the disinformation on that floor that day. You know, take pesticide policy out of the mix. Disinformation anywhere in policy decisions is not good. I mean, if we can't base policy decisions in real facts, in real science, what can we what what good is this? Um
Can you give us
and
a couple examples?
so again, that let me see. Well, first of all, and this has been happening routinely in the news. I have to sort of transition into Maha because I don't know if you guys have looked at the Make America Healthy Again. I have read that actually,
We spent quite a little bit of
because
time talking
that's
about Maha with Elizabeth too.
okay. That's and so I'm seeing that in there as well. So to me, the disinformation that we saw on the House floor in North Dakota dealing with House Bill 1318 is very similar with some of the disinformation that we are actually kind of seeing in the Maha when we start thinking about pesticides. Okay, first of all, I think the public should know if you can't say the word glyphosate, you probably don't know what you're talking about. Okay, because there are a lot of individuals out there that just really have challenges with that. You could hear that on the floor of the House, as well as, and you can hear that
Glyphosate
nationally
is
quite a
what they like
bit.
to say.
Yes. And and I think it's so funny because, when I at NDSU, when I took my pesticide classes, not only did I have to know how to say all that stuff, I had to spell all of those names correctly on the test because our professor took off for that. So if you didn't spell orloxyphenoxypropionate correctly, you were getting points off. And what else can I tell you? Okay, so that one, the comparison to Agent Orange, I found completely disconcerting. I don't know if they tried to speak again on there. It's been a while since I watched
The Agent Orange
that
one, I
House floor.
remember they were talking about how when they did use it in Vietnam, they were off label then too, and it's a totally different chemical. But
A
they really
totally different
represented
chemical.
it as the same chemical at a different concentration on the House floor.
Ironically, the individual that dispelled that explained why it was disinformation, the representative that spoke to that, his name is Representative Murphy. He's actually a professor at University of North Dakota, and he is a scientist up there. UND is not the agriculture school. NDSU is. We are blessed with two very great universities in the state. I have to say that. Um, Otherwise, my mom went to that school, and she'll get mad at me if I don't say that UND is good. But so he was the person that took a look at that chemistry and actually compared those on the House floor to explain why the comparison between Agent Orange and glyphosate doesn't make any sense. And honestly, he took 2 seconds to look at that. I think he was doing like a Wikipedia search right there on the House floor while this whole debate was going on, and he dispelled it. So it's very concerning.
Well, this is the process, and I think this is why it's important to have these discussions and get this information out there because when you hear this stuff and you see these settlements and these different lawsuits and it's a lot of money and money validates, so when you see these things happen it's important. Well, we got a fight on your hands here to protect agriculture, and without your voice and people like you speaking out about this, we're just going to continue to go in the wrong direction.
Well, I was just going to say that, disinformation kind of runs the world in a way, not in a good way. But just today on the way over to Slater, I listened to a couple different radio stations, and they were talking about today was Musk's last day with the administration, and one of the stations was, well, he was leaving because you know he couldn't go any further, and he wasn't happy with the big beautiful bill or whatever they're calling it and things like that. And the other station was, well, he's leaving because to work temporarily for the government, you have 130 days and his days are up. So I tend to believe it's probably the 130 days. Uh, that made a lot more sense than he's leaving because of some fixation with what the other station was trying to say. But it just goes back to fake news, I guess, is what they've kind of labeled it. And if you can if you can build up a rapport of people believing it, then your professor that got up and talked about it unfortunately talked second, and a lot of people are only going to hear what they heard first, and that's just kind of how. a lot of people tend to be that way. I mean, I think most people are. What's here first is kind of what sets in your mind, and then you have to discredit it, or that's going to be what it is. I'm not saying that's right, but it's kind of how life kind of seems to work in politics often.
It is kind of how life works. And I don't know what politics is like in Iowa, but I know in North Dakota we have a system here that's very close to the people. You know, we have a citizen legislature. Um, the my representatives and senators, I'm very close to all three of my guys, and they're all involved in agriculture in some way, shape, or form or another. It's not hard to get involved in politics. Honestly, all you have to do is care about something. And it's not even about knowing how to write a bill or anything else. It's about telling your story and what your experience is with whatever that item is. Um, I've gotten to know enough people in the legislature and those kinds of things just because they're just people. They're just people that I know from North Dakota all over. And they know that I'm a professional in agriculture, that I've spent a few years making recommendations with pesticides, handling pesticides, so that when I walk in there and I tell the story, they know that. So it's just about creating relationships and making things happen and telling a story.
Yeah. My path to politics, I was in the Iowa legislature, started with our county wanting to build a landfill kitty corner from uh, my wife's and our farm, and that kind of got me started in politics. So you've had a taste of how it kind of works and all that. Do you have any inkling that you may run for an office someday or anything?
um, Not at this time. I actually am. My son is only like 7 years old, and so before I would do anything, I would want to see him graduate from high school and a couple things like that. But I actually currently serve as the District 20 chair for our Republican Party here in North Dakota. So that's been it's a really weird experience being in party politics, but in some ways it's also a really great experience. I've gotten to meet some really great people through that. Um, I currently serve as the chair of the State Board of Ag Research and Education, and actually we're charged by Century Code in our state with the budgeting authority for our Ag Experiment Station and Extension. And most states with their egg experiment stations would be very jealous of having a board like ours to do that. Um, we have a lot of specialty crops in North Dakota, so you can imagine that there's probably not a lot of ROI for a company, a basic manufacturer investing in, for example, like lentil acres, because there's just not enough of those acres nationally. So we really depend on our egg experiment station and extension to make sure that we're getting research to make sure that those crops are doing very well, because those are very economically important to a lot of our farmers.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, we appreciate you coming on and telling your story, and I think it's a very important message that needs to be told, and people need to hear it. And the Maha has a very loud, resonating voice. We need People need to be tuning in and consuming both sides of the information to make their decision. But thanks for coming on. I think you got a lot of good points out there today, and hopefully listeners can tune into that and gain a new perspective.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you also for coming on the show. At some point, maybe you'd be interested in coming back and we could talk about how the oil industry affected North Dakota and policy on farms and whatnot. Maybe, and if you're not the expert on that, maybe you could lead us in the right direction. But thanks
Absolutely.
for coming on today, and I hope our listeners rush back for another episode. Thank you.